there is one universal truth about wedding days, it's that you can plan for absolute perfection. You can control the flowers, the catering, and the music, but you can never, ever control the deep-seated psychological issues of your extended family. For most brides, the worst-case scenario is a drunk uncle giving a slightly inappropriate toast, or a bridesmaid tripping on her heels down the aisle. But my nightmare was something far more calculating. My nightmare had a name, a permanent, passive-aggressive smirk, and an unbelievable sense of entitlement. Her name was Susan, and she was my soon-to-be mother-in-law. From the absolute very first moment my husband and I started dating, Susan made it her life's mission to remind me that I was merely a temporary guest in the grand, dramatic production of her life. She genuinely believed that she wasn't just losing a son, but that she was being actively robbed of her perfect little boy by a woman who simply wasn't good enough. For 2 entire years leading up to the wedding, I swallowed my pride. I ignored the backhanded compliments about my weight. I smiled through the deeply insulting remarks about my career. I genuinely, foolishly believed that on the most important day of our lives, she would finally put her massive ego aside and act like a normal, supportive mother. I was so unbelievably wrong. It was exactly 2 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. I was sitting in the center of the beautiful sunlit bridal suite, surrounded by my closest friends. We were sipping expensive champagne, laughing, and for the first time in months, I felt completely relaxed. My hair was perfectly styled, my makeup was completely flawless, and my gorgeous, custom-made gown was hanging right behind me, waiting to be put on. The atmosphere was absolutely perfect. And then the heavy wooden door to the suite slowly swung open, and the entire room instantly went completely, terrifyingly silent. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence where you can actually hear the air conditioning humming in the background. Standing directly in the doorway was Susan, but she wasn't wearing the elegant, understated navy blue mother-of-the-groom dress that we had specifically picked out together and that I had personally paid for 6 months prior. No, Susan was wearing a wedding dress. And I don't mean a light-colored cocktail dress that could maybe be mistaken for white in the wrong lighting. I mean a full-length, heavily beaded, pure ivory white wedding gown. It featured a deep sweetheart neckline, delicate sheer lace sleeves, and it literally had a small train trailing behind her on the carpet. The only thing missing from her head was a literal bridal veil. I physically felt the blood completely drain from my face. My maid of honor, Sarah, looked like she was about to catch a felony charge right then and there. Her hands clenched into fists, and she took a half-step forward. But Susan just stood there, posing in the doorway, beaming with this utterly unhinged, perfectly practiced, angelic smile. She floated into the center of the room, did a little twirl to show off the beadwork, and loudly announced to the frozen room that she just felt the navy dress was far too depressing for such a joyous, happy occasion. She claimed she found this little vintage gown at a high-end boutique and thought it celebrated the purity of a mother's eternal love so much better. I couldn't speak. I was completely paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated audacity of what I was witnessing. She was staring directly into my eyes, practically holding her breath, waiting for the explosion. She was desperately waiting for me to scream, waiting for me to completely break down in hysterical tears, waiting for me to ruin my carefully applied makeup and give her the massive, dramatic victim narrative she was so hungry for. And I was incredibly close to giving it to her. I felt hot tears of pure frustration burning the back of my eyes, but before I could completely break down and ruin my own day, my wedding coordinator stepped in. Her name was Maria, and she was a legendary, no-nonsense woman in her late 50s who had been running luxury weddings for over 25 years. Maria stepped directly in front of Susan, completely physically blocking her view of me. By the way, if you've ever had to deal with a deeply toxic mother-in-law trying to steal your joy or completely hijack a major life event, take a second to hit the subscribe button right now, because you are going to absolutely love the masterclass in revenge that is about to unfold. Maria didn't yell. She didn't shame her. She gently placed her hands on Susan's shoulders, gave her a painfully fake, overly sweet smile, told her she looked very unique, and firmly, physically escorted her backwards out of the bridal suite, securing the heavy door behind her. The absolute second the deadbolt clicked, Sarah exploded, screaming that we needed to find the cheapest, darkest bottle of red wine on the property and accidentally spill it all over Susan's ridiculous dress. But Maria turned around, completely calm, and looked at me with the cold, calculating eyes of a seasoned military general preparing for battle. She walked over, put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Do not let that woman see you sweat for even a single second. If you cry, she wins the game. If you scream at her, she becomes the helpless victim and you become the crazy bride. We are not going to ruin a perfectly good dress with cheap red wine. We are going to do something much, much better. We are going to give her exactly what she wants." A few minutes later, there was a soft, rapid knock on the side door of the suite. Our lead photographer, a quiet, highly observant guy named David, slipped into the room. He was followed closely by our DJ, Marcus, who had been setting up the massive sound system in the reception hall down the corridor. Maria quietly explained the absolute disaster that had just walked through the front doors of the venue. David just slowly smiled, shook his head, and began meticulously adjusting the settings on his camera. Marcus actually laughed out loud, a deep, booming laugh, and rubbed his hands together like a supervillain. You see, wedding vendors absolutely despise people like Susan with a burning passion. They spend their entire weekends, their entire careers, watching deeply entitled, narcissistic family members actively try to ruin the most important, expensive days of their clients' lives. And they rarely get to fight back because they are bound by professionalism and contracts. But today? Today was entirely different. Today, they had a bride who was giving them complete, unrestricted permission to execute a flawless, highly coordinated operation of absolute social destruction. Maria laid out the brilliant strategy. There would be absolutely no confrontation. Nobody was going to ask Susan to change. Nobody was going to yell at her or pull her aside. We were going to treat Susan exactly like she so desperately wanted to be treated. We were going to treat her like a bride. We were going to lean into her absolute delusion so heavily and so publicly that the sheer weight of her own deep embarrassment would completely crush her in front of 200 of our closest friends and family. It wasn't just my personal revenge anymore. It had instantly become a powerful alliance of seasoned professionals who were about to deliver an absolute masterclass in malicious compliance. David quickly outlined his very specific part of the plan for the photography sessions, explaining how he was going to manipulate the framing. And then Marcus leaned in and whispered his absolute genius, completely savage idea for the grand reception entrance. I wiped away the single tear that had managed to escape my eye, took a massive, deep breath, and finally smiled, a real smile. I didn't feel like a helpless victim anymore. I felt incredibly powerful. I was about to become the executive producer of the greatest, most humiliating show Susan was ever going to star in, and she had absolutely no idea what was coming.